good to go. So hello and welcome once again, everybody, to our webinar at the Mission Zero Academy. My name is Kaisa Karjalainen and I coordinate the work of the Academy. And today we are talking about biowaste, organics, and what are the opportunities, coming regulations and options for the cities to handle in the best possible way. And a few tips for the webinar. Feel free to say hello to your fellow participants in the chat function of Zoom. If you have any questions for our speaker today, you can use the Q&A function. We pick up the questions from there as we go, and then there is some more question time available in the end. And other than that, get comfortable, enjoy the webinar, and hopefully you get some useful tips for your work. And today we are in conversation with Enzo Favoino, who is the chair of Zero Waste Europe Scientific Committee and a mastermind behind lots and lots of impressive biowaste transformations in cities in different parts of the world. Welcome, Enzo. Thank you so much for talking to us today. We are really looking forward to hearing from you and your past experiences today. Would you like to introduce yourself shortly to get things started?
Sure, with pleasure. First of all, thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy. This sounds exciting. We are just a few steps before a major change in European waste policy, which is Article 22. We will discuss it with the related obligation for separate collection of the organics, which makes me the happiest man in the world, and particularly proud to be European in this respect. Anyway, yeah, you say the basics about me. Actually, my working place is Scuola Agraria del Parco di Monza, which is a research and technical development center based in North Italy, right north of Milan, 20 kilometers north. I've always been working with them since 30 years, but just because I started very young, when I was only 5, if you want to calculate my age. We had a relevant role in promoting separate collection and improvement in the management of organics, not only in Italy, but also in many other European countries, including, for instance, Spain, Catalonia, Euskadi, the Basque Country. In the United Kingdom, we provided technical and scientific support to RAP, the Environment Agency, and so on and so forth. We work quite frequently also with European institutions to define a waste policy in different areas, and namely, first and foremost, in the area of organics. I was one of the founders when it comes to organics. I'm one of the founders of the European Compost Network, which is now the reference network on the management of biowaste. And I have been chairing for 10 years, 2 mandates, the working group on biological treatment at the International Solid Waste Association. So whenever organics are on the agenda, I try to be there, because that's my starting passion. But then I moved progressively into zero waste programs, because once you tackle the organics, you make the big leap forward, and this will be one of the key messages we want to convey today. And so you get ready for zero waste programs and for true, full, effective circular economy.
Great, thank you. Lots of expertise online today, so we are really looking forward to this. And yeah, today is all about organics and what to do with it. But let's start off with a question. What is effective organics management, and what are the benefits? They form a big part of municipal solid waste and very uncollected part at the moment, and in residual waste it's mainly causing trouble. So, give us the background on why this is an important topic worthy of a webinar.
Yes, indeed. Well, basically, you already mentioned one of the key angles of organics management, which is the quantitative angle. They are the largest contributor to recycling rates. And there is no way, let me say once again, no way, and let me stress it once again, no way to achieve the long-term targets of the European Waste Framework Directive, namely 65% preparation for recycling and reuse by 2035, if you do not implement also consistent programs for the management of organics. Well, this will be anyway compelled by Article 22, but we will go back to that in a while. But not only from the quantitative angle, there's also a pivotal operational importance of proper management of organics, because organics are the fermentable stuff in our waste. It is the one which is causing nuisance, odors. So once we grab them, once we divert them into the proper stream, sending them to a composting facility or an anaerobic digestion facility, then we will have residual waste with a much lower fermentability, which allows us to implement operational optimization of the system, in particular, reducing sharply the collection frequency for residual waste, which in turn exerts a positive pressure on better separation also of packaging waste, paper, plastics, glass, metals, and so on and so forth. Also, let me bring up another few environmental angles, because biowaste is really at the crossroads of many bits of environmental policy. Not only the Waste Framework Directive and proper waste management, sustainable waste management in Europe and everywhere around the world, but also the fight on desertification. There is a United Nations Convention to combat desertification, which draws attention of policymakers, decision makers, local actors, on the need to restore organic fertility on soils, and composting is a fundamental contributor in this respect, the Paris Agreement on the United Nations Convention, but also the climate policy, the need to store more carbon in soils. Well, of course, we try to tackle climate change, trying to reduce, to curb the amounts of carbon dioxide which is in the atmosphere. But in the atmosphere, we have around 400 ppms of carbon dioxide, whereas the largest carbon pool in the planet after the oceans, which is the real largest pool, is soils. So if we manage to store more carbon in soils in the total amount of carbon in the planet, we will have more carbon in soils to produce fertility and less carbon in the atmosphere to produce climate change. And this is what also the new common agricultural policy draws attention to, with the so-called carbon farming strategy and options.
Great. Lots of benefits and importance in organics management, and the EU is finally putting forward some policies about it. And the key here is the Article 22 of the Waste Framework Directive. So for the people less familiar with European policies, can you give us the lowdown on what is it all about, and what are especially maybe the changes or the requirements coming for the cities?
Oh, that's great. As I already said, that will be the next big stuff we have got on the agenda. Article 22 basically establishes an obligation, a common obligation for all European member states and for all the local authorities, the local decision makers, to implement a separate management of biowaste in order to be collected and sent to a processing facility or to be managed on site, for instance, by means of home composting or community composting. But anyway, it has to be managed separately, because the European Union, after years and years of discussion, you know, there was a first draft of a potential biowaste directive at European level as early as 2000 and 2001. And of course, we contributed to the underlying discussion, but then it was put in the drawer. Probably time was not mature yet for that. But now we have got this obligation. So we will have to manage organics separately. This is important, and as I already said, it's a huge step forward, because if we consider that from the quantitative angle, which is not the only importance of managing organics properly, but from the quantitative angle, you know, we know that in Europe, still organics make the largest part of municipal solid waste. Typically, they say 1/3 of municipal solid waste is organics. This tends to be not entirely true, because in composition analysis of municipal solid waste we do, the first thing we do is to separate the so-called fines, -20, the smallest particles. And we classify them as miscellaneous or fines, but 80% of that is organics. And once we implement separate collection programs for organics, they tend to be captured within the stream, which will go to composting and anaerobic digestion. So actually the potential tends to be higher than what is typically represented in official compositional figures for municipal solid waste around Europe. But this also very largely depends on the, the economic and the social patterns in different areas. In many rural districts, in Southern Europe, in Central Eastern Europe, we still find more and remarkably more than 50% of municipal solid waste made up of organics. And so you understand how important this will be for really a big jump forward in European waste management strategies.
Yeah, great. So collection is in the very core of this new policy. So then can you give us some options? What are the collection options there for cities to implement, and especially in what kind of situations are they good or not so suitable? We have in the audience local authority representatives from different countries and different size of cities or contexts, so it would be interesting to hear what are the options for different situations.
Yes, of course, I will provide a very quick overview because, of course, we may discuss for ages, and I'd be the happiest man to discuss for ages, but we do not have the time today. But anyway, just to stick to the basics, of course, there are different approaches, but we do know there are more performing systems and less performing systems. Anyway, implementing separate collection of the organics is a good step in the proper direction. But of course, we would like it to be as performing as possible. We did a study, for instance, a joint study between Zero Waste Europe and bio-based industries, which is an European network promoting bioeconomy, on what we called the so-called untapped potential of biowaste. So how much is still the distance to targets that we may foresee in the next few years with a full implementation of what is foreseen in the obligation for separate collection of the organics. And so we know what are the countries where there is a higher capture of organics related to the overall potential of the system, and those countries where there is a lower capture, or those countries where there is no capture at all, with specific regards to kitchen waste. Because basically, I would say, separate collection of garden waste is one of the easiest things to be done. And this would be something I would recommend everybody consider right away, implementing some separate collection of garden waste. You may just open up your municipal recycling centers and tell the households, please take your organic waste there, or get ready to be taught on home composting programs, because we can teach you how to do some home composting. But of course, the next big stuff will be separate collection of kitchen waste. And we do know what are the systems which are more performing and those systems which are less performing. However, as a very big overview, we can have basically two main groups of approaches. One is the so-called bring systems, which are based on large containers which are kept permanently on the roads. This tends to be a voluntary participation system, because you may go there or you may not go there. And then there are the so-called curbside systems, or door-to-door collection, which basically come and pick your waste on the collection day for a specific stream to be collected. So on a certain day of the week, or every other week, or twice a week, depending on the climate zones, they will pass by and collect your organics. This tends to be more participatory, because basically it's the only way to get rid of your organics. That collection day, they will pick your organics, and so you will be positively pushed to separate your organics, to set it out, and to have it picked by the municipal collection service. Also, well, this is a nice slide because it shows one of the potential approaches to separate collection. This may be codified as a two-stream collection, And as far as I can see, it may be, you know, the gray bin for residual waste and the blue bin for all the packaging waste. So where does the organics end up? Organics end up in such a system into residual waste. So there is no separate collection of the organics. An evolution of the system is the 3-bin system. This is very diffused in North America. For instance, San Francisco, which is one of the reference situations for zero waste programs, they have got a 3-bin system. One is for organics, one is for all packaging waste, and one is for residual waste. And so we start having a positive action on separating organics. Another evolution may be 4 streams, separating paper from other packaging in order to have a better quality of paper and to have a higher price value, market value on the market for selling paper on the market of commodities, or even 5 streams. 5 streams seems to be the most diffused one in many situations across Europe. 5 streams is based on basically organics, or better to say kitchen waste, but we will discuss it later on. Glass, paper, then lightweight packaging, which is plastics and metals together because they are lightweight, they are unbreakable, and they are compactable. So they may be compacted in order to optimize operational and economic angles of collection, but then it's very easy to have them separated through magnetic and their eddy current separators. And then we have got one bin, a dedicated bin or a bucket or a bag for residual waste. Of course, we do know what are the more performing systems. What we have to consider is always what we call the key performance indicators. And the key performance indicators should always be in, let me list them very, very briefly, the captures in kilograms per inhabitant and year, and I'd keep them split in terms of kitchen waste and garden waste, because as I already said, it is very, very easy to collect garden waste. But when we do have garden waste, we do have gardens where we may promote home composting. And so does it make sense to maximize captures of garden waste? Probably not. So actually what really matters is the capture of kitchen waste, which is what historically we may find in municipal solid waste. Then another key performance indicator is quality of the collected organics. Another one is the percentage of organics in residual waste. This is probably the best key performance indicator in order to understand how effective is the system in diverting organics from residual waste and from disposal. And of course, it keeps together the positive action we may implement on food waste reduction and separate collection, composting, and anaerobic digestion. And so this is the most important key performance indicator. But I would also add, to put some icing on the cake, customer satisfaction analysis. So if you ask people, are you satisfied with the system? Is it working well? Because the system, first and foremost, has to show to be user-friendly. And we will go back to these later on.
Great. There's a question from the audience while we were talking about the key performance indicators. Now that there's new regulation coming, do you know if the Commission is also going to set a target for the recycling of bio-waste?
It's not on the agenda yet, but I'd be very, very happy for that to be discussed. I would say, actually, our proposal has always been the other way around, what I just mentioned, the percentage of organics still in residual waste. That's the best key performance indicator, because if we set a separate collection target for organics, this may hamper the home composting programs. Because with home composting programs, you have got materials which is escaping separate collection and gets not counted as separately collected. It may still be counted as recycled, because as you know, under the Waste Framework Directive and the Commission implementing decision on calculating preparation for reuse and recycling, there is the possibility to calculate home composting as recycling. But basically, to my opinion, the best way would be, let's test how much organics are still included in residual waste. So we keep together the positive actions we may implement on reduction, promoting home composting, separate collection, composting, and anaerobic digestion.
Great, thank you. So yeah, regulation is about collecting it, but then just collecting it separately doesn't do any good. We need to also treat it somehow. So could you walk us through next what treatment methods there are for cities to choose for to deal with their organics?
Yeah, right. Well, of course, historically, the management of organics has been based mostly on composting. Composting is very easy to be designed and implemented. It's a very robust technology, relatively easier to manage than anaerobic digestion, which I will discuss in a while. And it basically mimics what happens in nature. So it's a partial decomposition, we call it stabilization of organic matter, in order to get rid of the easily degradable compounds in organics, because if they degraded inside the soil, this may cause some detrimental effects, such as taking up the oxygen from soils, which would hamper the microbial activity in soils. It may produce some volatile fatty acids or ammonia, which may exert a phytotoxic effect on roots, on shoots, on seeds, and something like that. So it is better to have such stabilization of organic matter in a controlled environment, which is the composting site. And then we come up with the final end product, which is compost, a carbon-rich material which is stabilized, and so it may be used in a wide variety of applications. Then we may have a young compost, a fresh compost, a more mature compost, which is more suitable for different applications, but this would lead us too far, I fear. Anyway, ready to take this on during questions and answers if anybody is curious about that. Then there is anaerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion, basically, what does it do? It replaces the early stages of composting. During the early stages of composting, we degrade the easily degradable compounds and we turn them into water vapor and carbon dioxide. This is biogenic carbon, and so it is considered to be climate neutral from a life cycle perspective. So we do not have to worry that much about that. But anaerobic digestion makes another huge step forward in that it keeps carbon as methane in a fully anaerobic environment. And so we do not lose the carbon as carbon dioxide, but we keep it as methane. It is fully renewable methane, and it may replace fossil gas, for instance. So it may be used to propel the same waste management trucks or public transportation, or it may be used to replace fossil gas in the kitchen fires and something like that. Or it may be burned in order to produce electric energy, even though we are less supportive to this because it would be a less efficient use of biomethane, because there is the energetic efficiency of converting thermal energy into electric energy. However, both anaerobic digestion and composting are codified as organic recycling. So anaerobic digestion is not energy recovery. It is organic recycling, in that both composting and anaerobic digestion, they end up with a final soil improver. So what really matters in both systems is that at the end of the story, I have got a clean, qualified, carbon-rich material, which may be suitably used for agricultural purposes. And that's the most important in the system. Both are organic recycling. But let me stress another important bit in the story. Let's not forget about scalability of composting. You know, I love composting under many different angles, but probably one of the main ones is that it is fully scalable. It may be done in your backyard, and it may be done in the largest site in the world. There is the one which is servicing the city of Milan, which totals a capacity of 700,000 tons a year. And so it is fully scalable. So let's not forget that composting may be promoted and implemented also through home composting and community composting. For instance, we do have our case studies from the city of Besançon in France, or you may consider Pontevedra in Galicia, in Spain, where there was a consistent planning of organics management, mainly based on community composting. So these are other important bits in the overall strategy for the management of organics.
Good, thank you for that. So then following down the chain, you already mentioned that both of these treatment styles are able to produce good quality soil, but then it still needs to be used somehow. So what are the opportunities and maybe the limitations of using this treated organics as whatever comes out of the anaerobic digestion or the composting plant?
Let me address the limitations first, because it's easier. Stupid things first. So when it comes to the limitations, first of all, we need a clean and safe product. And the only way to have it clean is to get it through separate collection. So we avoid all the avoidable pollution in the system, okay? Also, I already briefly mentioned, and let me bring it up once again, there are different maturity products, composted products, which may address different specific needs. For instance, a fresh compost is more suitable for our kitchen gardens because it's much more prone to release very fastly the included nitrogen. Nitrogen is the booster for the growth of vegetables, and so it may be important for that. More mature compost, instead, is perfectly suitable to replace, for instance, the growing media. For instance, in pot cultivations, in the greenhouses, in flower pots, in landscaping, when we have got a plantation hole or something like that. So we need a very mature compost. This is called ripe compost in Germany, which means ripe, mature compost. Compost maturo in Italian, or you may go with whatever language you want. Now, coming to the specific fields of application, of course, agriculture. I hold a Master of Science degree in Agricultural Sciences. So this is my field of expertise. And once again, I could talk for days and weeks about that, but let me cut it short, long story short. Of course, the traditional way of using compost has been in such industrial large crops as corn, for instance. Those are called as the renovation crops. You know, in the agricultural cycle, those are the crops which benefit from supplies of organic matter. And compost is perfectly suitable for that. But I already mentioned, for instance, landscaping. Landscaping and greenhouses are much higher added value activities, and so they reward compost in a much better way. Because, you know, we used, for instance, to harvest peat from the peat bogs in Baltic countries in the past, or from Ireland, but now we know those are very sensitive ecological areas, so there is a protection legislation on that, and so we tend to import peat, maybe from Canada or from other areas in the world. What's the issue with that? Harvesting peat bogs is almost cost-free. It's not very expensive. But then transporting a very lightweight material from Canada to Europe is very, very expensive. So the replacement value of using compost instead of using peat is incredibly important. But of course, peat and compost are not precisely the same material. Under many angles, compost is better than peat because it's more nutrient rich and microbes rich, so we do not need pesticides because there is what we call the suppression power towards the root diseases, the shoot diseases of vegetables we grow in pots. But we have to change slightly the growing technique, for instance, giving less fertilizers, which implies a savings. But if we use compost and we use the same amount of fertilizers, it's like, overfeeding the plant, and this may cause problems. So it's all about not just changing the material, but changing slightly the growing technique as well. However, there is one last point I would like to bring up. I already mentioned carbon farming and the need to sequester carbon. This is a particularly promising sector. There were regions here and there across Europe which had adopted in last few years the so-called regional development plans. The regional development plan is a subsidy plan whereby you may subsidize farmers for actions which are benefiting not to them directly, but more to the community. And so such subsidy plans were rewarding farmers for using compost instead of using chemical fertilizers, so as to fight desertification, eutrophication, and climate change. And that's very, very promising. And I think in the near future, this will become one of the main sectors where the marketing value of compost will achieve new levels. But if I may, there is one last point I would like to do. We are discussing both producing compost, separate collection, composting sites, anaerobic digestion, and using and selling compost. Using and selling compost is a different job than producing compost. When you have got a car maker, the car maker has got the engineers designing the car, then there is the factory producing the car, and then they have got the dealers, and it's the dealers, not the engineers, selling the car. So we cannot have the waste management companies selling compost because they do not have the appropriate wording in order to engage with the farmers, their networks, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, there were many mistakes in the past in this respect. So in the near future, I see it more as a 2x game, with those producing compost and doing it right, and those selling and giving value to compost and doing it right.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions from the audience related to this, and also the different treatment methods. First of all, about the anaerobic digestion and composting divide. Do you see anaerobic direct digestion widespread around Europe, or what's the kind of divide between those two treatment methods in different countries?
Oh, it's catching up very, very fast, because it's, it may be subsidized under the Renewable Energy Directive. The Renewable Energy Directive fully acknowledges the role of biomethane as a replacement renewable fuel in order to meet the renewable obligations by different countries. We have got a very ambitious agenda on decarbonization in Europe, because we want to become carbon neutral by 2050. And anaerobic digestion may give a certain contribution in this respect. So it's fully catching up. For instance, if I consider a country I know very well, Italy. In Italy, currently, the total organics processing capacity consists of some 8 million tons a year. It should be ranking second after Germany, or the same level as the United Kingdom when it comes to the total composting capacity. However, until a few years ago, basically 90% and more of the capacity were composting, straight composting. And now 50% of the capacity is anaerobic digestion combined with composting. Let me stress something which is very, very important. For us, zero wasters, and also for me as an agronomist, it would be very, very important to have anaerobic digestion not as a full replacement for composting, but only as a replacement for the early stages of composting. I think that digestate should always be post-composted in order to fully fetch the benefits of giving organic matter back to soils. And only if we fully stabilize organic matter, we will have maximized benefits and minimized inconveniences of giving organic matter back to soils.
Great. And the second question about the different treatment styles, how do you position biodrying between composting and anaerobic digestion?
Can you say that again, because it was a little bit choppy?
How do you position biodrying between composting and anaerobic digestion?
Biodrying, well, biodrying, I know it very well. It's called Trockenstabilität in Germany, but biodrying actually pertains to residual waste management, not so much to clean organics. If you mean drying the organics instead of having them composted, it doesn't make much sense from an agronomic standpoint, because as I already told you, it's biological stabilization that makes the job. We need to let the microbes eat up the most degradable compounds in order to transform the remainders into a very beneficial product. And biodrying only gets rid of water, but once you put a biodried material into the soil, well, it gets wet, fermentation starts once again, you take up the oxygen from soil, it may get phytotoxic, depending on the amounts, of course, and so on and so forth. But biodrying makes sense to me when it comes instead to certain strategies for residual waste management, but this is not the issue of the day.
Right, thank you. So then let's move on to some inspiring examples who have done all this you have explained to us up until this point really well. So could you give us a few great examples from different types of cities?
Great, yeah, there is an impressive overview. Thanks God, you know, this is not brand new in Europe. Actually, and there is an obligation on separate collection of the organics in the Netherlands since 1995. It was stipulated in Germany since January 2016, as far as I remember, even though even before the Kreislaufwirtschaftsabfallgesetz, one single word is in German because, you know, they are world champions in the word length. It is the federal law on circular management of materials already stipulated that the best management of organics is through composting or anaerobic digestion. Anyway, separate collection, separate management of organics. So we do have a very diversified set of cities and villages where this has already been implemented. Italy, by the way, and brought forward the obligation to January the 1st this year, because we do have already 80% of the population connected to separate collection of kitchen waste. Not only bio-waste in general, but kitchen waste. 100% is connected to separate collection of garden waste, because as I already said, it's the easiest thing to be implemented, separate collection of garden and park waste. However, let me mention a few situations. There's quite a few municipalities which achieve 80% and even 90% separate collection. And in all of them, separate collection of the organics has been a fundamental step in order to go that far. It's 122 municipalities according to last official statistics validated by the Environment Agency. Those are mainly smaller municipalities, because in larger cities, you know, we have got the daily commuters, we have got the visitors, and so this makes it more difficult. But we will discuss large cities in a while. Then let me discuss, because of course we may say, yeah, 90%, but it's small village point results. But we may consider in large areas, Flanders, Wales, they are around 70% and more separate collection. Sardinia in Italy. We did a case history on Sardinia at Zero Waste Europe, because Sardinia is an island with a very high tourist flow. 21 million visitors a year in a region totaling only 1.5 million people. And they have got a regional average of 75% separate collection, thanks to a big priority, a big focus on the management of organics. Then let's move to Central and Eastern Europe. We, for instance, supported the pilot schemes in Romania. Let me name one for all. But of course, we do have Slovenia. Slovenia is a worldwide leader in separate collection, thanks to consistent programs on zero waste, including the national capital Ljubljana, and separate collection of the organics. 100% of the Slovenian population is already connected to programs for the management of organics. So it's always the booster for separate collection levels. But in order to make everybody confident, will it be possible in my own country, because we are at 3%? 4%, 5%. Let me discuss Salacia or Shalax, because they are bilingual in the north western part of Romania. In Romania, most of the villages, municipalities, they're around 5% separate collection. We implemented curbside collection, including organics, with the 5 streams model I discussed a while ago. And they went right away to 70% separate collection. And now they, they are the reference model for all the other municipalities in Romania to follow suit. But now let's go towards the larger cities. I already mentioned Ljubljana. Ljubljana totals a population of 350,000 people. Bristol in the United Kingdom. Bristol is one of the largest cities in the United Kingdom, 500,000 people, and it is fully covered with separate collection of the organics. This slide refers to Milan, Milan city. Milan totals 1.4 million people, 100% of the population is connected to separate collection of the organics. And besides 1.4 million inhabitants, it has got 800,000 daily commuters and 20 million visitors, including the many delegations we host in Milan to visit separate collection of the organics. So this has boosted the visits from abroad, I would say. But if I may, because as I said, this all comes to the key performance indicators. Let's consider Milan. Milan is currently capturing 105 kilograms kitchen waste per inhabitant and year. 70 kilograms are from households and 35 kilograms are from the large producers, because we do have restaurants, canteens, greengroceries, pizza shops, and so on. But 70 kilograms per inhabitant in year come from the households, which is basically, between 15 and 20% of the total amount of municipal solid waste. Also, we calculated, checking the amount of organics in residual waste, we calculated a capture of organics of 87% of the total organics generated by the city. So we may be confident that this may be done everywhere in North Europe, South Europe, large cities. Milan has got a population density of 8,000 people per square kilometer. And as you can see, the skyline, the skyscrapers, we are doing separate collection also in the skyscrapers. So it may be done. It may be done.
Great, thank you. So then maybe next, a few good effective ways to maximize the capture of organics and then also improve the quality.
Oh yeah, let me use a statement I often use when I make my presentations in conferences, international webinars about separate collection, and more specifically separate collection of the organics. We say waste is like water. It always flows the easiest way. So we need to make the flow very easy. And the key word in this respect is user-friendliness of the system. Typically, there are 2 cornerstones in user-friendliness of the system. One is the frequency of collection for organics. The frequency for collection of organics must be remarkably higher than the frequency of collection for residual waste. Because we do know there are comparatively low captures of organics still in many areas around Europe, including areas with a long track record of separate collection of the organics. But sometimes, it is based on collection on alternate weeks. 1 week is organics, including kitchen waste, and 1 week is residual waste. So the week in which they collect the residual waste, where would you put your stinky stuff? In residual waste. That's the problem. That's the problem. So we need to keep the collection frequency for organics higher than the collection frequency for residual waste. And the only way to do that, that's another fundamental operational angle in cost optimization of the system, is we have been discussing biowaste so far, but you may have noticed that many times I was specifying kitchen waste and garden waste. Of course, they go to the very same site, which is a composting site or an anaerobic digestion site. But probably it doesn't make much sense to collect them together, because on the one hand, we have got a material, namely kitchen waste, which is very, very stinky and fermentable. And so we need to collect it very frequently, but it is not so bulky. It has got a very high bulk density. On the other hand, we have got garden waste, which is much less fermentable, and it is very bulky. So if we collect them together, first of all, first operational issue, we need to provide extra room for the extra production of garden waste during the growing season. But then in wintertime, it will be almost empty, the bin, because we will only have kitchen waste inside. Second problem, second operational issue, if we collect them together, we have got the fermentable and stinky stuff inside, which would call for a more frequent collection of organics, but we cannot do that very frequently because we have got big wheelie bins in order to make room for garden waste. And unfortunately, this is much more expensive than smaller buckets with hand picking, which takes much less time. So it's all a matter of proper designing of the system, which saves time, and saving time implies also saving money. Of course, this also depends on the type of dwellings. We tend to use the small buckets for the detached houses with a backyard, or for the semi-detached houses, because each household may have their own buckets for hand picking. But with the high-rise buildings in Milan, 90% of the population lives in high-rise buildings. It makes no sense, of course, to have many different buckets. We use the wheelie bins, and the families, there's 15, 20 families per each wheelie bin. So with one single pick, with one single wheelie bin, we service 15 to 20 families. And once again, we have got a time optimization and cost optimization of the system. This allows us to keep the collection frequency comparatively high. In Milan, it's twice weekly for food scraps, for kitchen waste, and only once weekly for residual waste. And so, you know, it nudges people in separating better the organics, but also plastics, metals, glass, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you. And then around organics, there's of course different myths and misconceptions on like what can you do with it and what you can't do with it. And there's especially a question in the chat about the animal byproducts and the fertilization requirements. Could you clarify a few of the biggest ones, especially addressing this animal byproduct question?
Yeah, I'm particularly happy about this question because unfortunately this is causing headaches here and there across Europe. Unfortunately, for poor implementation of the animal byproducts regulation at European level. Indeed, we do have some sanitary legislation that was stipulated after the outbreak of the foot and mouth disease and the mad cow in the early 2000s. And of course, I kept it monitored from near. I was mostly involved in European composting network. Zero Waste Europe was not there yet. Still a bright future was still to come for us. But I was mostly working with International Solid Waste Association, Working Group on Biological Treatment, and European Compost Network. And but actually, we had it done right, because unfortunately, what sometimes the veterinary services in many countries do is to say, hey guys, animal stuff, such as meat and fish, is high risk, and therefore it cannot be collected with the rest. Of course, if we do not collect animal stuff, meat, fish, and so on and so forth, this will end up in residual waste. And so it will concentrate in residual waste because in the meantime, we have taken out from residual waste paper, glass, plastics, metals. And so it, you know, whatever we do not collect separately concentrates in residual waste. But it does not make any sense. And the very same animal byproducts regulation classifies the so-called category 3 catering waste, so food waste which is not coming from international transportation, which is what we are discussing right now, separate collection from households and from restaurants and from canteens. It is not coming from international transportation, you know, after consumption, I mean. So it classifies that as low-risk material. For that low-risk material, national legislation applies. National legislation implies a certain time-temperature combination in order to ensure full sanitization of the compost. And so there is no need for gold plating and overly complicated regulation. The solution is already there. The animal byproducts regulation fully preserves also meat and fish from overly complicated regulatory frameworks because it is considered to be low-risk material.
Great. Hopefully this clarified this point. Then there's another very common question that we hear a lot, and it's also coming from the audience, so great that we anticipated this. So what about the concept of biodegradable or compostable packaging of products? How should municipalities guide citizens and businesses to deal with them? And answer us once and for all, like, do they go in the organics or residual or plastics bin?
So first of all, it goes into the organics, of course, no discussion about that, provided they are certified compostable according to the relevant European standard. Thanks God, we have got a very solid European standard since 2002. I also contributed to definition of the standard on behalf of the environmentalist European networks. It's EN 13432, okay? This is the reference standard at European level. And it is also mentioned in relevant European legislation. Actually, Article 22 says that materials which are certified according to relevant European standards on compostability may be co-collected with organics. But of course, the underlying question is, where does it make sense to use compostable plastics? Because I am against a widespread adoption of compostable plastics. I am very supportive to sensible use of compostable plastics. And when I was discussing the need to ensure user-friendliness of the system, actually, I only discussed the collection frequencies, but another important leg in the system is the tools we provide people in order to have a clean, safe, user-friendly system. For instance, if I may, these are the typical bags that may be considered. Also the paper bags, you know. This is a paper bag which is being used in many situations across Europe, or the compostable plastic bags. This is certified compostable. Probably you can see or not, I don't know. Anyway, there is the logo of Compostable, and it is certified according to the European standard EN 13432. So for the bio bags, as we call them, the bio bags, for separate collection of the organics, this has fully proved to be a fundamental tool in order to maximize participation, maximize captures, minimize organics in residual waste, and therefore reduce sharply on the collection frequency of residual waste, which leads to further operation optimization of the system, as we just said. And in Milan, it would not have been possible to implement such an effective system capturing 87% of the organics without the use of the biobags. Then there are only a few other niche applications, limited applications for compostable plastics. For instance, we do say packaging materials which are tightly connected with foods materials and which are inherently dirty at the end of their useful life. Typically the coffee capsules. Of course, we as zero wasters, we tend to promote old ways of brewing coffee, the mocha. Don't tell an Italian how good it is to brew coffee with a mocha. But there are the challenges of modern life. In offices, it's very difficult to say, use the mocha. So they use the coffee capsules. So why not compostable plastics for the capsules? In Italy, the main coffee makers have got their brand offer with compostable coffee capsules. So now they can go together with the organics towards the composting site instead of going to an incinerator or a landfill site. But when it comes to other applications, such as, you know, some are proposing the bio bottle made of compostable plastics, it doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't make any sense at all. Above all, because we do have specific targets at European level, as you know, stipulated in the Single-Use Plastics Directive, 90% separate collection of PET bottles, which will compel us to consider deposit refunding schemes. And so we may have closed loop recycling bottle to bottle instead of bottle to a sweater or a jumper or whatever. For a few specific applications, they make sense and they have to go to organics. And I think that common guidelines on where compostable plastics make sense in the European Circular Economy Agenda will be defined in the context of the so-called essential requirements, which is being discussed now at the European level.
Great, thank you for this very comprehensive answer. And we have a few more minutes left. So for the end, your best 3 tips for cities. We have lots of local authorities here in the call today to turn organic waste into fertility.
This is always the question I love most, even though, you know, it's very, very challenging because unfortunately, of course, not unfortunately, thanks God, I have to address different situations from different areas around Europe, and Europe is a diversified sample of different areas, rural areas, industrial areas, high density cities, small villages, Central Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and so on and so forth. But one first thing I would like to say is do not consider the organics agenda as something separated from the rest of the waste management agenda. It has to become the cornerstone for a total revision of the waste management service in your area. So once you implement separate collection of the organics, also revise and redesign the way you manage residual waste, for instance. For instance, cutting on the collection frequency for residual waste. This is the first hint. The second hint, plan the needed capacity, of course, and keep it flexible. For instance, in many countries around Europe, in order to comply with the obligation on pretreatment stipulated in the Landfill Directive, Directive 99/31, we have got an obligation for those, for non-EU people in the audience. We have got an obligation on pretreatment, which was one of the most important provisions in the European regulatory framework because it pushed operators to internalize the environmental externalities of landfilling, and it made disposal more expensive. So it was the biggest, probably the biggest push towards more recycling, waste reduction, because it made the residual waste management more expensive. Of course, it still has to be fully implemented here and there across Europe, above all in the Central Eastern European countries, but do it right. Keep the system flexible. There are many MBT sites, mechanical biological treatment sites, which may be turned already into quality composting sites because they are based on composting technologies. So before considering additional investments, consider the possibility to flexibly adapt what it is already in your hands and in your local plans. And the third recommendation would be always be confident. We can do that. And as we say in the Zero Waste Global Networks, be always happy and never satisfied. Happy because you have to rejoice for what you have already achieved, be it a small step, be it a big step, but never satisfied because even I already mentioned those municipalities achieving 90% separate collection. Believe it or not, we celebrated only one day, but the following day we went to the mayor to say, hey guy, we have got 10 more holy steps to reach perfection. So always happy and never satisfied.
Great, thank you. I think this is a very nice way to end this webinar. We are running out of time. Thank you so much, Enzo, for talking to all of us today and answering our questions in a comprehensible and inspiring and also comprehensive way. Always great to hear from you. And thank you for all of our participants as well. We will follow up putting the recording of this webinar up to the Mission Zero Academy website. So if you need to revisit, it will be there as soon as we get it done. And thank you all for participating, and we look forward to hearing from you and your inspiring examples.
Thanks all for listening. It was exciting for me. Thanks, Kaisa.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.